The wind came howling down from the high ridge, dragging sheets of snow like they were curses spat from the mouth of God himself. And in the middle of that fury, with ice crunching under boot soles and shutters slapping their hinges like gunfire, the widow knelt by her root cellar door. She wasn't praying, she was prying it open. No one in town thought to come help. That March morning, most folks in Alders Hollow were too busy trying to salvage the last rotten logs in their sheds, cursing the wet pile of mold-stained firewood they'd sworn would last the winter. Roofs had buckled, chimneys cracked, and fires across the frontier were going cold. But 30 feet beneath a hill, no one ever bothered with. Her fire still roared. They'd laughed when she dug it all right, not behind her back, but loud, sharp, and in her face. "Underground storage?" Sheriff Caldwell had said with that amused half-chuckle he reserved for widows who didn't know their place. "Lady, ain't no need for that nonsense. You're just burying sweat." The settlers echoed him. Old Bruckner from the mill, the clay boys who ran lumber. Even the preacher, polite as he tried to be, couldn't hide the disbelief. "Better build a proper woodshed instead of playing mole," he'd said gently. "Rain's God's way of testing your roof, not your tunnel." But she hadn't built a tunnel. Not exactly. It was deeper, colder, tighter. A 6-foot drop into a chamber she'd cut by hand over the course of a brutal summer. Every stone hauled out by rope, every timber hewn from trees she chopped herself. No help from town, just a widow and a hatchet. And her boy, Nathan. He was 11, quick to listen, quicker to fall sick. And that's why she dug it. The snow hit early that year. October brought frost so sharp it etched the windows like a knife had scratched them. November never saw the sun. By December, horses were dying in the fields, and Mrs. Alder herself, the mayor's sister, had frozen in her sleigh with her eyes wide open. But inside that widow's cabin, the hearth burned clean, dry, strong, and not once had she pulled wood from the stack outside. The secret wasn't just the storage, it was what she did with it. Back in July, when the hills were blister hot and men were stripping to their waists to haul water, she'd vanished each morning into the hillside. Folks figured she was grief-buried, digging a garden to distract herself from the empty bed. They weren't entirely wrong, but what she carved wasn't soft soil, it was shale and clay. And every inch she cleared, she braced, with stones fitted tight as teeth, with split log ribs cut from mountain pine, with moss-packed seams to keep the ground from sweating on her stash. No one else knew that wood could spoil just by sitting still. That sunlight leaches resin. That dry bark means nothing if mold creeps up from wet soil. She knew because her husband had taught her. God rest Jacob Moore. Killed in a flood 2 years back, along with most of the lower pasture, but not before passing down what his grandfather had passed to him. If you can't keep it dry, it ain't wood, it's rot waiting. So she built the chamber, layered it, treated it, even burned a smoking fire inside it for 2 days to draw out the last damp. Then she stacked it, one log at a time, on cedar planks laid above packed gravel. It wasn't beautiful, but it worked. By February, the rest of Alders Hollow was in ruin. Sawdust logs from the mill had turned to mush. Half the firewood in town hissed more than it burned. Sickness crept in behind every cold hearth. And so they came. First the preacher, then the clay boys, then finally Caldwell himself, knocking at her door one cold night after sunset. "We're out," the sheriff admitted. "We thought maybe you had some spare." She stared at him, then at the 2 children behind him, then back into the flames dancing inside her cabin, where her son lay curled on a bearskin rug, cheeks pink, breath warm. She stepped aside and let them in. There were rules. You could take only what you carried. You had to work to restock come thaw. You had to acknowledge, without sneering, how she'd kept it all dry. Some swallowed pride and did just that. Others refused. By March, her pile was still half full, and not a single log had grown mold. She'd open the hatch each morning, descend with a lantern, feel the bone-dry air brush her face, and smile. The cold had tried to kill them all, but she'd outdug it, outplanned it, and outlived it, and by spring, even Caldwell stopped calling it useless. They began to ask how she'd done it, and that was when the real story began. Because the firewood, that wasn't even the cleverest thing she'd hidden beneath the earth. The thaw came slow that year. March gave way to April without color, the trees still stiff with frost, the ground reluctant to soften even when the skies wept for days. But in the cracks of the crusted snow, green began pushing through. Here and there, like bruises healing, life returned, and along with it came reckoning. The settlers of Alders Hollow had survived the worst winter anyone could remember, and while most had scrabbled through with damp wood and colder beds, one cabin stayed warm, one boy didn't cough blood, one fire never dimmed, and it wasn't just the logs. They knew it now. Something else had kept that widow and her son safe, something more than pine stacks and smart digging, something deeper, and Caldwell wanted to know what it was. He showed up again, not long after the melt started trickling through the ravines. This time, he didn't bring children, just himself, just his badge, and a face lined with something unfamiliar. "Ma'am," he said, hat in hand, "I'd like to see it." She didn't answer right away. She'd been turning soil near the edge of her hill, loosening the clay where her carrots would go come May. Her arms were dirt-streaked to the elbows. The wind had softened but not disappeared. She didn't look up, just kept digging. "You saw the firewood," she said finally. "What else is there to see?" Caldwell shifted, boots grinding the gravel path. "I think you know," he said quietly. "That's storage. It's more than just logs, ain't it?" She paused, straightened, and met his eyes with a stare that had once made grown men stop talking mid-sentence. "Is that a request, Sheriff?" she asked. "Or a demand?" He hesitated. "A request." They walked in silence to the back of the cabin, where the low stone arch squatted like a mouth. The wooden hatch had warped slightly from freeze and thaw, but still opened smooth. The widow lifted it, the iron hinges barely whispering, and took a lantern from the hook nearby. "You brought a gun?" she asked as she struck a match. Caldwell blinked. "No." "Good." The steps down were narrow, cut into the soil, then reinforced with scavenged bricks. The air grew colder as they descended, not freezing but steady, stable, the kind of chill that preserved, not killed. He noticed the planking first, not just cedar laid beneath the firewood stack, but a second, shallower set of boards sunk into the left side of the chamber. He squinted. There was something beneath them. She moved ahead of him and slid the slats aside, and there it was. Not wood, not food, but books, dozens of them, wrapped in oiled cloth, bound tight, layered like treasure. "Where'd you get all that?" he asked, frowning. "My husband," she said, kneeling. "He was a reader, so was his father. They kept things most men burned when space ran low. I kept them dry." Caldwell knelt too, gently pulled one from its wrapping. It was a journal, not printed, handwritten. He flipped through it, and his face tightened. These are records," she nodded. "Logs, temperatures, storms, crop yields, settler movements, notes on cabin failures, flooding, drought. It's all there, 50 years of it, maybe more." The sheriff turned a page, then another. Maps, diagrams, a drawing of the valley with notations on which homes flooded in spring and which dried out fastest. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" he asked. "This could have helped people." Her expression didn't soften. "They laughed when I dug. They spat when I spoke. I don't waste breath on ears that don't listen." The truth was heavier than the winter. This widow hadn't just outlasted the cold, she'd mapped it, studied it, understood it. In the walls of that earthbound chamber lay knowledge no one else in Alders Hollow had thought to seek. Not the preacher, not the mayor, not even Caldwell with all his lawman pride. And the deeper they went, the more he saw. A second alcove, bricked in with mortar made from crushed eggshell and ash. Inside, dried herbs, sealed beeswax tins, preserved roots packed in sand. "Emergency stores," she said simply, "if the tunnel collapsed or the cabin burned." And farther in, still, past a braced beam so tight it seemed part of the hill, a second chamber opened, half the size of the main room, but twice as curious. Caldwell stepped through and stopped. It was a curing room, not just meat, though a few links of sausage hung high on wire loops, but wax-sealed jars of tallow, rope-tied bundles of fat wood, even a few flasks of rendered oil. "I was going to trade it," she said behind him, "if the river broke and the wagons didn't get through." "How'd you learn all this?" "My husband," she said again, "and his father, and books, and thinking, the kind of thing that comes easier when no one's interrupting you to explain why you're wrong." When they emerged, blinking into the evening light, Caldwell didn't speak right away. He wasn't sure how to. All his life, he'd measured worth by what men showed: land, cattle, coin. But here, buried under 6 feet of frost-hardened dirt, a woman had built more knowledge and security than half the town combined. He looked back at her hands caked in soil, her brow lined from work. Not a fragile widow, not a quiet victim, a tactician, a planner, a survivor. "I was wrong," he said finally. "You weren't burying sweat, you were planting it." Her eyes flicked toward the horizon, where the last snow was receding like a tide. "Too late to say that now," she murmured, "but early enough to remember it next time." The next time came sooner than anyone expected. By mid-April, as the town started rebuilding, patching roofs, digging out sheds, drying what wood hadn't gone to rot. Rumors spread up from the southern ridge. Coyotes starving early, game gone quiet, and something worse. Rain, not soft, spring rain, not the kind that coaxes flowers from the dirt, but hard, slashing storms with a low growl in their belly. The widow saw it first in the air, a pressure drop, a sharpness behind the breeze. "You'll want to brace the riverbank," she told the preacher, "and move your grain. Low stores will flood." He blinked. "Flood? This time of year?" She pointed toward the trees, where the trunks were swelling darker each day. Snow's melting in the high range, ground's still frozen underneath. Water's got nowhere to go but sideways. He didn't believe her, not fully, but he did shift his sacks off the floor. And when the first wall of water came through, fast as galloping horses and twice as loud, the only place it didn't reach was the widow's hill, because she'd mapped that too. She'd built her cabin a foot above the highest waterline the journals ever recorded, dug a channel around the back of the hill, and planted wild rye to slow erosion. It wasn't luck. It was knowledge, and knowledge, she'd learned, grows best underground. By the time May arrived, the town no longer asked why she built the way she did. They asked how, and for the first time in years she invited them in, not to mock, not to prove a point, but to teach, and that, more than any firewood, would keep them warm when next winter came. By summer her name wasn't whispered with mockery anymore, not by the clay boys, not by the mill hands, not even by Caldwell when he walked through town tipping his hat slower than before. She was no longer just the widow. She was Mrs. Moore, and that mattered now. Men who'd once mocked her called her Mom. Women who'd once smirked behind her back came knocking with pies and questions about how to keep mildew off winter quilts. And the younger ones, new brides, girls expecting, they asked how to lay a stone, how to test soil for frost depth, how to stack wood to breathe without drawing moisture. And she answered, not because she'd forgiven them, but because her boy deserved a town that wouldn't freeze him dead next time the clouds rolled in too thick. It was July when the second storm came, hot and strange and sudden. The wind began one night as a low moan through the pines. Nothing unusual, but by morning the moan had teeth. By noon, shingles ripped free from cabins like paper, and the preacher's new bell tower cracked sideways before a soul ever rang it. And through the smoke-colored sky, hail came like iron, not small, not like marbles or acorns, no, slabs, cold as death, dense as bone, crashing through windows, smashing buckets, slicing through fabric like razors. Caldwell's own roof caved on the east side. Half the town rushed for the church basement, but the widow and her boy, they stayed in. She didn't even raise her voice. "Bring the lantern, Nathan," she said calmly. "Time to go below." And just like that, they vanished into the earth, into a chamber built to outlast not just snow and rot, but wind that cut like God's own whip. That storm only lasted 6 hours, but when it cleared, 23 panes of glass across Alders Hollow were shattered, 3 roofs destroyed, 1 man concussed from debris, 2 horses blinded, and Mrs. Moore's cabin, not a scratch. No broken windows, no split rafters, no water pooling on warped floorboards. The stonework around her root cellar had absorbed every blow like it was built for war, which it was. She had fortified it, the eaves reinforced with iron pins, the shutters latched with leather loop dampeners that flexed under force, the root cellar lined with a slanted gravel trench that funneled water into a backflow pit she'd packed with crushed charcoal to prevent mold. Caldwell stood staring at it that night, long after the storm passed. "Looks like a bunker," he muttered. "It's a home," she replied. "But homes can be both." That was when the townspeople stopped asking for advice and started asking for blueprints. Not on paper, though. Few in Alders Hollow could read or write anything past their name, but they asked with tools in hand. By August, 6 other families had begun carving into their hills, none as deep, none as clean, but attempts were made. And through it all, the widow oversaw quietly. She didn't bark orders or gloat. She walked between builds, nodded at mistakes, offered better ways to brace walls, smarter ways to vent smoke. She taught them how to layer gravel beneath food barrels to wick moisture downward, how to use beeswax to seal lids against mice, how to hang ropes from the ceiling to tell if dampness was creeping in. And she watched, because watching was what taught her the first time. One evening, with summer curling toward fall and the sun hanging long in the sky, the preacher came by with a question that took longer to form than usual. "I heard from a passing trapper," he said, hands nervously wringing his hat, "that settlers 2 valleys over lost their cabins. Flash flood, took half a herd." She was kneading dough, bare arms dusted with flour. She didn't stop. "And, well, the river here runs shallow, but..." He hesitated. "Could it happen here?" She dusted her hands clean, walked to her maps, not books, maps, hand-drawn charts from her late husband's journals, and her own surveys. She'd layered them across an old door turntable, shaded elevations, notched trees, measured flood lines with bits of string and clay weights. She pointed. If that hill breaks, she tapped a ridge 2 miles west. We'll have 30 minutes, he frowned. Before what? She looked him in the eye. Before everything below the chapel gets wiped clean. It changed the air. Not panic, but preparation. For once, Alder's Hollow began to listen ahead instead of react behind. The Clay brothers dug drainage near the West Ridge. Caldwell rerouted the wagon trail to higher ground. Families started storing root vegetables in shallow pits lined with stone. Even the schoolhouse was reinforced. Beams thickened. Window boards kept ready in the loft. And the widow? She started digging again. Not for herself this time, for her neighbor. Mrs. Dalrymple had been left widowed too, just the year before. Her husband had gone looking for their runaway dog in a blizzard and never returned. And though no one said it aloud, most assumed the cold had claimed them both, man and hound, beneath a drift. She'd spent winter quiet, polite, freezing in her one-room shack with a baby wrapped in blankets so thin you could see the child's skin through the cloth. So the widow built for her a secondary storage pit, shallow but clever, roofed with cross-laid stone and braced with cut limbs from a black pine Nathan had helped fell. The boy worked the rope, the widow worked the axe, and Mrs. Dalrymple wept quietly the first night she descended into a dry place that didn't reek of mildew or rats. "You didn't have to," she said, voice shaking. The widow didn't look up from her hammer. "No one has to? But somebody ought to." By late September, the town's tone had changed entirely. Where once they mocked, now they mimicked. Where once they dismissed, now they documented. Caldwell began drafting official town plans for emergency shelters. The preacher started teaching sermons that used her strategies as metaphors. "The wise woman builds below the storm" became a favorite refrain. And Nathan, quiet and clever, was no longer teased at the schoolhouse for having a mother who wore work boots instead of skirts. Because Nathan had never gone hungry. Because Nathan had never shivered at night. Because Nathan had survived. And now he was growing, fast. But stories like this don't sit easy forever. Not in the frontier. The first whisper of trouble came not from weather but from strangers. A trio of men with hard faces and city clothes arrived one afternoon on muleback. They claimed to be prospectors, but they carried rifles and asked too many questions. One went straight to Caldwell. One visited the preacher. The third, he waited outside Mrs. Moore's cabin until dusk, then knocked once, hard. Nathan opened the door. He was 14 now, tall for his age, already carrying firewood without a grunt, but his hand hesitated at the latch. "Your mother home?" the man asked. His accent was clipped, not local. Boots clean, too clean, nails filed, eyes flat. Nathan started, but the man pushed, not inside, just with his voice. "We heard she's been storing supplies, teaching others, drawing maps. Seems she's built something under the ground." Nathan's jaw clenched. "You heard wrong." "No, son," the man said softly, stepping closer. "We heard exactly right." And then he smiled, not kindly. When the widow appeared in the doorway, she didn't raise her voice. She didn't reach for a weapon. She just looked, long, cold, measured. The man tipped his hat, pretending politeness. "Evening, ma'am. Name's Sawyer. I'm from the east, land assessor of sorts. Word is you've done some interesting developments here." "Word travels where it's not invited," she said. He chuckled. "Everything travels these days, especially value. And what you've got here, this setup, this land, these plans, well, they're valuable." She didn't blink. "This is a homestead," she said, "not a prospect." "Sure, for now," he said, voice smooth. "But maybe we talk. Maybe there's a future here. Investment, expansion. You've built something big, and big things don't stay quiet." Her hand moved slowly to the doorframe. "Leave," she said. "Ma'am." Now, he left, but only to rejoin the others. And Caldwell wasn't the only one to notice that the trio had maps. Not from Mrs. Moore, not from the journals, but from someone. Someone had talked, and the question was, what would these outsiders do with what they knew? Because frontier winters weren't the only threats buried in the soil. Sometimes danger didn't howl in snow or crash in hail. Sometimes it smiled. And sometimes it came wearing boots that had never once stepped in mud. The men didn't leave. They stayed in Alder's Hollow through October, renting space in the back of the general store and asking questions in low voices. Sawyer, the tall one, with the neat nails and cleaner boots than any honest man ought to have, did most of the talking. The other two, no names offered, only nods and silence, watched and waited. And folks, though wary, began to talk, not out of trust, but because greed sneaks in when fear fades. "I heard there's silver under the ridge," old Bruckner told the preacher, voice rough with drink. "That's why she dug so deep. She ain't stupid, that one." "Nonsense," the preacher muttered. "She was storing firewood, not mining." But the idea, once planted, stuck, because people liked stories that gave them something. And Sawyer, with his gloved hands and smooth voice, fed it just enough truth to make it grow. Of course, it's more than just silver, he'd say in the saloon. It's the land, strategic, secure, elevation, runoff control, natural drainage. She's sitting on a textbook example of frontier design. Whole towns have been founded on less, and every man who'd nearly lost his roof to the storm or had his wife near freeze last winter began to see that Widow's Hill not as a homestead, but a blueprint, a commodity, and commodities could be bought or taken. Nathan caught them near the woodline first, late October. The trees were half bare, the wind had gone cold and impatient. He was coming back from the ridge with a sack of pine resin when he heard boots behind the brush. He stopped, listened, breathing. Two men, quiet but not careful. He turned. One man stepped out with a shovel slung across his back. "Just scouting," the man said, smiling like it was his land. Nathan didn't say a word. He didn't need to. He just stared, long and hard, until the man's smile faded. And then Nathan turned and walked home. Not fast, but slow, deliberate. That kind of walk says we're not scared of you. It's the kind of walk his mother taught him. The widow didn't panic when he told her. She stirred her stew, salted it, tasted, then wiped her hands on a cloth and stepped out into the cold. Nathan followed. They walked together, up the ridge, along the edge of her property where stones had been kicked loose and a bush had been crushed by careless feet. She knelt, studied a footprint. "Too deep," she murmured. "Heavier than you. Wears square heels. City boots." "What do they want?" Nathan asked. Her fingers brushed the disturbed soil, then packed it back gently. "They want what they think is valuable, but they don't understand that staying warm in the mountains is worth more than digging cold metal out of them." That night, she sat by her lantern and pulled down the old map again, the one her husband had traced from tales passed down, not drawn from survey tools. It showed more than geography. It showed history, old footpaths, abandoned homesteads, places where families tried and failed, and beneath it she slid a newer parchment, her own, not written with flair, but precise: shaft depths, soil types, water flow during storms, where frost lingered longest, where mold grew first. She studied them, side by side, then turned to her son. "Nathan," she said, "if something happens to me, you know what to do." His jaw tensed. "Nothing's happening to you." She met his eyes. "That's the plan," she said. "But we write these things down for when plans go sideways." The first threat came not with gunfire, but with paper. Sawyer returned 2 days later, this time carrying a rolled deed and a smirk that wouldn't break. "I've acquired claim rights," he said, standing at her fence like it was his stage. "Not to your cabin, of course, but to the ridge behind, and to that hill yonder, just over the rise." She didn't answer, so he pressed on. "The tunnels you dug, they cross into that claim. I've had a surveyor check. Technically, part of your underground storage lies beneath my land." "You've never seen the inside," she said. He smiled wider. "I don't need to." Caldwell arrived before the tension broke. He'd caught wind of the claim filing and rode hard from town, sweat still drying on his collar, despite the chill. "Back off, Sawyer," he snapped, stepping between them. "You don't know where her storage ends." "I know enough," Sawyer replied, "and I've got papers to prove it." "I've got eyes," the sheriff growled, "and a town full of folks who'll vouch that she built all this before you ever set foot in the hollow." Sawyer folded his hands behind his back, real casual. "Then let the courts decide," he said. That's when the widow changed tactics. She didn't fight Sawyer. She didn't march into town or beg Caldwell for help or ask the preacher to rally support. She taught. Every evening for a week, she opened her root cellar to one family at a time. She showed them how to build properly. She let them sketch her layout. She handed out portions of preserved resin, scrap charcoal, and bits of moss-packed insulation. And she said nothing about Sawyer, because you don't beat snakes by wrestling them. You starve them. Still, the strangers didn't give up. As November approached and the nights grew sharper, the men began creeping closer. They started cutting small paths through the brush, trampling young rye, leaving scraps of jerky or broken twigs behind like unspoken threats. Once, Nathan caught one crouched behind the chicken coop. He didn't shout. He lit a lantern and raised it slow until the stranger's face glinted in the light. No expression. Just blank skin and unblinking eyes. Then the boy drew his slingshot, didn't fire, just aimed. The man left. He didn't come back, but they were building towards something. You could feel it in the air, the way dogs barked at night for no reason, the way the widow stopped letting Nathan check the outer traps alone, the way Caldwell passed by 3 times in 1 week, saying nothing but watching too long. Then In the last week of October, with snow threatening in the clouds and all of Alder's Hollow stacking their final logs for winter, Sawyer struck, not with a bullet, but with a writ. He rode into town with a circuit judge trailing behind him in a hired wagon, waved papers in the saloon, claimed trespass, claimed structural encroachment, claimed mineral rights. And the judge? He didn't know the Hollow. He didn't know what that widow had built or how many had survived because of it. He just knew papers. The preacher came running. "They're holding court at sunrise," he said breathlessly. "Said it's the law. Said she has. To come defend her claim or surrender her land." Nathan stared at him. "Can they do that?" The preacher wiped sweat from his collar. "Not if they knew what was buried beneath their boots. But these men, they don't care about root cellars. They care about leverage." The widow didn't flinch. She lit her lantern, brushed flour from her apron, and walked inside to her ledger, a small book, bound with thread, pages filled with notes in her tight, even script, and from it she pulled a folded parchment. Not a map, not a deed, but a letter. At dawn they rode into town, Mrs. Moore, Nathan, and Caldwell, trailing behind the preacher's wagon. The courthouse was nothing but the old schoolhouse repurposed, but it had benches and a desk and a small sign that said justice carved by the preacher's own hand. Sawyer was already there, seated smugly, flipping through his papers. The judge, too. The proceedings began dry, Sawyer's voice smooth and smug. He claimed mineral rights, overlapping boundaries, encroachment, claimed the root cellar might be hazardous, unregulated, claimed there were deeper chambers that no woman could possibly have built alone. And then, when silence fell, the judge looked to the widow. She said only one thing. "I have a letter." The judge raised an eyebrow. "From whom?" She handed it over. Signed by General Clarence D. Hatch, 3rd Frontier Engineering Corps, dated 6 years prior, to whom it may concern. The bearer of this letter, Mrs. Mary Ellen Moore, widow of Jacob Moore, is recognized for her contribution to the structural design of post-flood rural shelters following the flood of '67. Her methods were adopted in multiple Army field manuals. Her site has been reviewed and documented as structurally sound and worthy of emulation. Any obstruction or disruption to her land shall be considered a hindrance to civilian defense infrastructure during times of disaster. The courtroom went dead quiet. Sawyer stared. The judge cleared his throat. I see no reason to proceed further. Case dismissed." Sawyer didn't linger after that. He didn't speak either. He just gathered his papers, nodded stiffly, and walked out. His men followed the next morning. They never returned. But the town didn't forget, because for the first time in memory, they'd seen what real defense looked like. It wasn't bullets or badges. It was a woman with calloused hands and a mind that thought 5 winters ahead, and the kind of storage that didn't just keep wood dry, but kept the future alive. The snow began falling 3 days after the court ruling, soft at first, drifting gently over the ridge and layering roofs like a blessing. For once, no one panicked, no one scrambled, and in the stillness that settled over Alder's Hollow, something else grew, something that didn't crackle like firewood or clatter like hooves. Respect, real, quiet, unspoken, not the kind you shout or stamp or hang in saloons, the kind that settles deep and cold and true, like water in bedrock, the kind that shows in how people act when no one's watching. Nathan was the first to notice the change. It started small. A pair of boots left drying by the widow's porch, patched, but not theirs. Then a pot of rabbit stew, still steaming, left near the door one evening with no name attached. And then the church bell, repaired after the storm, rang once at dusk, not for warning, but for gratitude. No one said it aloud, not yet, but they knew what she'd done, not just for herself and her boy, for them. By mid-November, the town was remade in quiet ways. Mrs. Dalrymple, whose hands once trembled from cold, now spent her mornings teaching others how to cure meat using beeswax and root ash, a skill the widow had taught her. The Clay brothers, once all sneers and sawdust, added gravel drains behind their newly dug storage pits, whispering about airflow like they'd invented it themselves. And Caldwell changed the most. He stopped talking so much. He started listening. He'd ride up to the widow's hill sometimes just to watch the snow settle across her roofline, smooth and even, never caved or cracked. He'd tip his hat and she'd nod, and that was all. Then came the real test. It struck without warning in the second week of December, when the ice had barely hardened and most were still stacking their final stores. A fire. The mill, Bruckner's sawhouse, caught flame in the night, maybe from a lantern left burning or sparks from the chimney. The fire roared like a beast with no skin, dry timbers snapping like bones. Smoke rose fast. The town panicked. Buckets were filled, lines were formed, but nothing slowed it. The water froze before it hit flame, and within 20 minutes the whole structure was gone, embers hissing in the snow like snakes. Bruckner stood in the aftermath, a man ruined. He had no backup stock, no firewood but what he'd promised to others, and no shelter, not now. The widow didn't speak that morning. She just saddled her mule, loaded 2 sacks of her own cured logs, and walked them down the hill, dropped them at his feet, said one thing, "Use it well," then turned and walked away. After that, no one called her crazy again. They called her necessary. Through the thick of winter, folks in Alders Hollow made their rounds differently. There were new paths carved through the snow, direct ones, efficient, storage pits dug just beyond heat radius, never too near open flames, tunnels packed with moss and gravel, copied from hers, sealed boxes of tinder made not from guesswork but tested mixtures of resin and pine fluff. Children no longer coughed themselves hoarse in wet clothes. Chimneys didn't reek of mold. The saloon even stayed open through January, its first time ever doing so, and on Sundays the preacher would smile his slow smile and say, "Mrs. Moore kept her firewood pristine. When the rest of us burned wet rot and frost." It always got a chuckle. But it wasn't a joke. It was gospel. Nathan grew in that winter. He wasn't just her boy now. He was his own. He handled the trapline solo, patched a leak in the roof himself with pitch and bark slabs, built a windbreak at the east side of the coop without being asked. And late one evening, when a tree came down on the trail and blocked the route to the river, he led 3 men with saws and cleared it himself, quiet, efficient, just like her. He came home that night with frost in his hair and his cheeks raw. She handed him a cup of tea and said, "You're ready." He didn't ask for what. They both knew. By late January, word had spread to neighboring settlements. Riders came through, some friendly, some curious, some hungry. Most wanted to know how a hill cabin had survived when their own collapsed, how a widow had planned better than 5 mayors and 10 sheriffs across 3 counties. She answered, few, but those who came with open hands and clean intentions she welcomed, showed them the bracing, the vents, the trick with hanging a rope inside to catch moisture in the air, the way to use egg white wash on inner walls to prevent mold during thaws. Not all believed her, not all listened, but some did, and those who did took the knowledge with them like fire tucked in a pocket. Then spring came again, fast this time. The melt arrived in a rush, ripping through the lower pastures, breaking dams and swelling every ditch into a creek. The hollow held. Every cellar but one stayed dry. Every cabin but 2 stood firm. And the wood, it burned clean, not a single stick wasted. When the warmth arrived fully in April, they held a feast. Nothing formal, just a gathering in the field beyond the chapel. Pies and dried meat and a stew so thick it stood in the spoon. Someone strummed a guitar. Kids ran in the new grass. And Mrs. Moore? She sat in a rough carved chair, legs crossed at the ankle, watching with a quiet satisfaction that needed no applause. Caldwell raised a cup in her direction. "To the woman who kept us warm," he said. "To the woman who thought underground," added the preacher. Nathan just smiled beside her, and for once no one laughed. Later that night, as the sun dipped behind the pines and stars came out sharp and cold in the blue, Nathan asked her what came next. "Do we build more?" he asked. "Deeper? Bigger?" She considered that, then shook her head. "No, we don't build bigger." He frowned. "Why not?" She looked out over the town, the cabins, the sloped roofs, the paths she could trace by memory, fires glowing soft in every home. "We build smarter." And so they did. 5 years later, when a reporter from some back east journal came west to write about frontier innovation, he found more than log cabins and frost-bitten men. He found a town with root cellars that never flooded, firewood that burned dry, families that didn't fear snow or storm. He asked who'd started it. They pointed up the hill. She wouldn't speak to him, but she let Nathan do the talking. He said only this: "Folks thought my mother's storage was useless, until spring came, and their wood was mold and ours still cracked when you split it.